Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you back again for the beginning of our last morning of input. Today, I'm going to look at one area of theology to which the rediscovery of the wisdom tradition is very relevant indeed. And I should be looking at the role of wisdom in creation theology. Now, secular folk call it environment theology, but we call it creation for a very obvious reason. And the text with which we're starting today is Psalm 104, as it is in the Qumran text, the version of Psalm 104 that was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls, that is slightly different from the Christian Hebrew. And it's different in very significant ways. So verse 24, Lord, how manifold are your works. With wisdom you have made them all. The earth is full of your creatures. That's the same in both texts, and I have put wisdom with a capital letter. Hebrew, as I said earlier, has no capital letters. And if you put in some capital letters, it does make some of the texts look rather different. And we know that there was a tradition that wisdom was present at the beginning of Genesis, at the beginning of creation. So it's perfectly possible that had they had capital letters, she would have had one here. And then verses 28 and 29 of the psalm, when you hide your face, they are dismayed. When you take away your spirit, they die. They return to their dust. When you set forth your spirit, they are created, and you renew the face of the earth. And the difference between this Dead Sea Scrolls text and the later Hebrew is in the second line of the second section. Dead Sea Scrolls text says, when you take away your spirit, they die. And the later Hebrew, which underlies the English translation, says, when you take away their spirit, they die. Clearly, there is a big difference between your spirit and their spirit. Your spirit implies that it's one spirit that gives life to all creatures and all creation. Their spirit implies that they are all separate. So it's very important to notice these little differences. And this is one of the small ways in which wisdom theology has disappeared from the current reading of particularly the Old Testament. Now, the Holy Wisdom. There she is. We've seen this one before in the apse of the Cathedral of the Holy Wisdom in Kiev. And that corresponds to the Holy of Holies of the temple. I showed you on our first morning how the Holy of Holies represents the state of unity beyond time, beyond matter, outside creation, the eternal source of all things. And so I have taken that picture of the Lady Wisdom and I have put her into the Holy of Holies. I could equally well have put there a picture of the Holy Wisdom as the fiery figure with her throne and so forth. But that's just to remind you how she corresponds to the figure in the apse of a Christian cathedral. We're going to look at the image of the lady as the weaver. Proverbs 8:23, at the first I was weaving before the beginning of the earth. So at the first, that is in the Holy of Holies, in the beginning, before the material, visible creation. At the first, I was weaving before the beginning of the earth. Now, this verb that I've translated weaving actually says weaving in the Hebrew. It's the verb nasak, N-S-K, and it can mean weave or it can mean pour out. And so wisdom is speaking in Proverbs chapter 8. And she says, at the first, I was weaving, or I was pouring out before the beginning of the earth. And because the translators were not really aware of the wisdom figure, the tradition of translating into English, after all, came with the Protestants, and they would have none of this sort of thing. And so they changed it, and the K was changed to a Hebrew D. And so at the first I was set up, or indeed at the first I was hidden away. There are various suggestions as to what this changed verb could mean, but there's actually no need to change it at all. At the first I was weaving. And I mentioned yesterday that Origen, in his comparative edition of all the texts of the Old Testament available in his time, both Hebrew and Greek, he begins Genesis 1 by saying, by means of the net, Bareshet, by means of the net, God created. And now, a new text we haven't seen before. This is from one of the Jewish mystical texts. This one is attributed to a rabbi from the end of the first Christian century, so perhaps a contemporary of St. John who compiled Revelation. This is the sort of period of development we're looking at. The Hekalot Rabbati, the great palaces. Your throne is a hovering throne, since the hour when you fastened the weaver's peg and wove the fabric upon which the completion of the world and its ladder stand. Now, I don't know what they mean by the ladder, but your throne is a hovering throne. We remember at the beginning of Genesis, the Spirit hovers over the face of the waters before the creation comes into being. This is the same picture. We don't know what ancient Hebrew would have had in mind when he or she heard the words that the Spirit was hovering over the water. We tend to imagine a bird fluttering, a dove, something like that. But who knows, they might have imagined the lady on her throne hovering. And here we have your throne is a hovering throne since the hour when you fastened the weaver's peg and wove the fabric. And the picture of the Holy Wisdom, the icon of the Holy Wisdom that we saw yesterday, she has that great stone, which is the foundation stone, and that was in the Holy of Holies. But that stone, the Even just means stone, Shatia, either means the foundation of the world, or it means the warp threads of a piece of fabric, the long threads that take the weight across which the weft of the fabric is produced. And so the stone that anchors the threads of creation is the foundation stone of creation, and it's there with wisdom enthroned above it. Now, this web or net that the lady presided over or produced is known as the covenant. Covenant in Hebrew is this word berit, which literally means a binding. And when you read of any covenant, it is a web that holds together either the two parties, or in the case of the covenant we are looking at, it is the whole creation. And there are many covenants mentioned in the Old Testament, even though the word covenant is never found in a plural form. There was the covenant with Abraham to give him the land. There was the covenant with David to guarantee that one of his house would reign forever in Jerusalem. There's Jeremiah's new covenant, because the old one had been broken. There was a great covenant at Sinai. And this Sinai covenant, keeping the Ten Commandments, is the one that has eclipsed all others. And in fact, it was one among many, and in the Hebrew tradition, not the major one. It was a subset within this older and broader covenant, which was associated with the web of the lady. Now, because the Sinai covenant has been interpreted in one particular way, people have come to think that the word covenant means some sort of bargain, what Donald Trump would have called a deal. And the deal at Sinai was, if you keep my rules, I'll see that you're all right. And that simply is not what the word covenant means. The covenant is no deal at all. The covenant is a promise. It's a promise that the creation will remain and will be bound together. And it's bound together in peace. It's known, it has various titles, the covenant of peace. It's known as the everlasting covenant, which can mean the covenant of eternity. Also known as the covenant of steadfast love. And I'll look at each of those three names in turn. And this is a promise. It's not a deal, it's a promise. But when human sin breaks the covenant, then the covenant itself begins to collapse. Now, the earliest reference we have to the covenant in the Hebrew scriptures, reading the books in their present order, is at the end of the story of Noah, Genesis chapter 9. When the bow is seen in the clouds, I will look upon it and remember the everlasting covenant that is between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. That's the first reference. Now, it is possible that there was a covenant with Adam, and this is mentioned in Hosea, but it's not mentioned in the Genesis account. Now, why this happens, I can't find out, I can't begin to suggest, but I will read you the passage in Hosea, and you will see some familiar words coming up. This is Hosea chapter 6, and it's Hosea confronting the corrupted religion of his time. Now, Hosea, Amos, Isaiah, and Micah were all active from about 750 to 700 BC. And they are all responding to an attempt to remove the lady somewhere about 750 BC. And this is Hosea. This is Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. I desire steadfast love, that's that word chesed, and not sacrifice, the knowledge of God rather than burnt offerings. But like Adam, they transgressed the covenant. They dealt faithlessly with me. Hosea, sorry about my voice, Hosea knows of a covenant that is based on steadfast love and the knowledge of God. And when we read knowledge of God in this context, it doesn't mean knowing God. And the word God can also be translated angels here because it's a plural Elohim. It doesn't mean knowledge about God. It means knowing as God knows, having the knowledge of the angels, seeing things, so to speak, with the eyes of God. And so Hosea knew that Adam had been part of a covenant of steadfast love that involved the knowledge, the heavenly knowledge, that was the essence of wisdom. Now, when we find Isaiah referring to the Noah story, Isaiah 54, he uses another name for the same covenant. And he says, even though the times we're living in are like the great flood of Noah, because they've just been overwhelmed by the army of Babylon in this case, Isaiah assures the people, my steadfast love shall not depart from you. My covenant of peace shall not be removed, says the Lord who has compassion for you. So the same context, the same covenant referred to in Genesis, in Isaiah 54, and also in Hosea chapter 6. Now, a name for the covenant, that this special covenant that we don't find in the Hebrew scriptures, but is prominent in the Qumran scrolls, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here is an example from the community rule. Now, whether this was the rule for that community or they were just storing this book, we don't know. But there was a group of people around who committed themselves to live again within or by the rules of the covenant of chesed, which I've here translated steadfast love. And so from the community rule, from the first column of that text, the master of the community shall admit into the covenant of steadfast love all who have freely devoted themselves to observing God's precepts, that they may be joined to the counsel of God. It's to do with wisdom and live perfectly before him. So this great all-encompassing covenant, which represents the net or the web of the Great Lady, has these three names. It's the covenant of peace, which means integrity, wholeness, as well as just peace. It's the everlasting covenant, literally the Brit Olam, which means it's linked to the hidden place, the Holy of Holies, and it lasts forever and it embraces all creation, because Olam can mean all these things. And the covenant of steadfast love tells you the nature of the bonds that bind this together. Now, this covenant was sealed, and it was sealed with the seal of the name. Now, the best example of this is from the prayer of Manasseh, and here extracts from verses 1 and 3. Prayer of Manasseh is a tiny little book which is found in the deuterocanonical texts, what Protestants call the Apocrypha. O Lord Almighty, who has made heaven and earth and all their order, who has shackled the sea by thy word of command, who has confined the deep and sealed it with your terrible and glorious name. So this sign of the name, which was represented by the diagonal cross, was also the sign that was marked on the forehead of the high priest to show that he served the Great Lady Wisdom. And the person who bore the name was himself or herself regarded as the seal that held all this web of creation together. And so you get that interesting early Christian hymn quoted in Colossians chapter 1. All things were created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. This is a reference to Christ, the Anointed One, as the seal that holds together all the threads of the Lady's Web or the Lady's Great Covenant. Earlier, in a rather more difficult passage to understand, a rather more colourful imagery, we have Ezekiel's vision and oracle of woe against a cherub who was set on the mountain of God in the Garden of Eden. And this is an earlier and possibly closer to the first temple version of this story of the Garden of Eden. And Ezekiel addresses the cherub figure. The cherub figure seems to be both male and female. The Hebrew of this passage is full of mixed form, shall we say. Sometimes you think you're reading a feminine, sometimes you think you're reading a masculine. In some cases, the pointing is such that you can make it mean either. But this heavenly creature, who is dressed as a high priest, all that detail of the gold and the jewels that this heavenly being is wearing, these are actually a description of the high priest's vestments. So we know a little bit of what this is about. And this high priest figure was the seal of the pattern, meaning the pattern of creation, or the word could be the seal of the measurements or the proportions. You are full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. And the end of that passage, this heavenly being corrupts wisdom for the sake of profit and business and all this kind of thing. And so this heavenly being is thrown from heaven and burned on the earth and turned to ashes. Now, clearly, Ezekiel's oracle of woe is set in this time of crisis in the temple, when the priests were either reforming or falling from grace, depending on which side of the argument you found yourself. But the high priest, or in Colossians, Christ, these figures were the seal of the Lady's Covenant. Now, these bonds of the covenant, they imagined as extending like a giant web throughout the whole of creation. It was a multi-dimensional web, and it held all things together. And Philo, who is an exact contemporary of Jesus, Philo tells us that these bonds of the covenant were actually the divine powers, the powers from day one, whom we sometimes call angels. And these were the invisible bonds of creation. The angels were the invisible bonds. And there is this passage, he refers to this several times. This is the clearest of the passages in Philo. He has made his powers extend through earth and water, air and heaven, and left no part of the universe without his presence. And uniting all with all, he has bound them fast with invisible bonds, that they should never be loosed. So the invisible bonds of the great lady's covenant are the powers or the angels. Now, Philo's community in Alexandria could also give this role to wisdom, because we read in the book of Wisdom, chapter 8, the beginning of that chapter, wisdom reaches mightily from one end of the earth to the other, and she orders all things well. So two thinkers, possibly within 2 or 3 generations of each other, in the Hebrew Jewish community in Alexandria, could describe the binding effect, the covenant effect of the great lady as wisdom reaching from one end of the earth to the other, or as the invisible powers binding everything together so they should never be loosed. Then we read this in the light of a text we've seen before, the Gospel of Philip. Wisdom, who is called barren, and you remember that is wordplay on the name Zion, so she's also the heavenly city, is the mother of the angels. So you've got taking three texts, you can put them together, and you can see that wisdom works through her children, who are the angels, and through them she reaches mightily from one end of the earth to the other, and she orders all things well. And then going back to the earliest instance of this image, we have that title at the end of Proverbs 8:30, that wonderful wisdom poem that we shall read in its entirety later. I was beside him, the woman who joins together, the amo. So wisdom is the net that holds the creation together. Now, two non-canonical texts here. The first, a wisdom text found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. It isn't long enough to have a proper title. And so it's just designated by numbers. 4Q means it was found in cave number 4 at Qumran. And it's fragments, and some of them are fragments, numbers 417 to 418. And this is addressed to somebody wanting to learn about wisdom. And you, son of understanding, it could be child of understanding, could be either gaze upon the mystery of how things come to be and know the paths of everything that lives. Now that text is fragmented. We're not quite sure about the word paths, but it looks as though that's what it should be. But the mystery of how things come to be. You gaze in order to acquire your mystery, acquire your wisdom and your knowledge. You don't read a text, you gaze at something. And when you gaze, you learn the mystery of, and then this is a Hebrew phrase, we don't know how to translate it. It's not in the Old Testament, and that in itself is significant. How is it that this key wisdom concept is not in the edited Old Testament? The Raz Nihye, the mystery, I think it means of how things come to be, and then know the paths or the ways of everything that lives. Everything is part of this great network. And by gazing upon something, and we don't know what this was, they were able to have some understanding of this mysterious web of life that wisdom held together. And then a text from the Hekkalot, again, another Merkava text. This is from Rabbi Nechunya, who was again a contemporary of St. John, who was compiling the book of Revelation. And he wrote a lot about the throne. And he says, your throne is a hovering throne since the hour when you fastened the weaver's peg and wove the fabric, we've seen this before, upon which the completion of the world and its ladders stand, many years and generations without end. And a little bit later, how he finishes this text, I saw the mysteries and the secrets, the bonds and the wonders, the weaving of the web that completes the world. That is how people in the Hebrew tradition, in the time of the first and second generation of Christians, imagined the creation. The mysteries, the secrets, the bonds, the wonders, the weaving of the web that completes the world. And that's the background to that Christian hymn about, in him all things hold together. Then something we've seen before, wisdom, the mother of the angels. This is Hebrew wordplay, and the heavenly city is the home of the angels. And this is wisdom. Now this is something that I love. This is a painting by an Australian artist, 1864, this was done. And she was a mystic. And this is how she imagined the glory of creation. And I love this picture, and all the swirls and all the things kind of joining together. And it's how I imagine the net, everything working in together. And then there was the tragedy, of course, of how all those bonds got broken. But I love Georgiana Houghton's Glory Be to God. Now, we have here the prologue to the Benedicite. This is the part that we don't sing as a canticle. Blessed art thou, O Lord, God of our fathers, to be praised and highly exalted forever. Blessed is thy glorious name, to be highly praised and highly exalted forever. Blessed art thou in the temple of thy holy glory, to be exalted and highly glorified forever. Blessed art thou who sittest upon the cherubim and lookest down upon the deeps, be praised and highly exalted forever. Blessed art thou upon the throne of thy kingdom, to be extolled and highly exalted forever. Blessed art thou in the firmament of heaven, to be sung and glorified forever. And then the part of the Benedicite that we think of as the Benedicite and sing, all ye works of the Lord, bless ye the Lord, praise him and magnify him forever. That starts, but this, looking at the prologue to the Benedicite, this gives us the context. All the works of the Lord are what the Lord sees enthroned in the Holy of Holies, and he looks out over the temple which represents the creation. And this is very important for what we should be looking at next, because the temple was regarded rather like the picture of Dorian Gray in the attic. And Dorian Gray, I'm sure you all know the story, Dorian Gray never seemed to get any older or to change, but his picture in the attic did. And all the changes and chances of life were registered in the portrait and not in the individual. And they regarded the temple as the place where all the sins of the people were recorded. And so when you polluted the creation in any way, when you committed a sin, you might think you got away with it. But in fact, your sin polluted the temple. And towards the end of the First Temple period, that dramatic description of the chariot throne with the likeness of the Lord enthroned upon it, Ezekiel chapter 1 and then chapters 8 to 10. That is leaving a temple that is so polluted that it can no longer be cleansed, and that the lady and her son enthroned can no longer stay there. And what has happened is that the sins in the land have been registered as pollutions in the temple, and the temple represents the creation. And so when we have, we shall look at this later, when we see the rituals that were used to cleanse the temple, this wasn't actually cleansing the temple simply as a building. It was the ritual cleansing and restoration of the whole creation, the whole land, removing the effects of the sins. Now, I should very much like, if this is possible, to show you a short film clip now to end this first session this morning. Is it possible to, this is a wonderful clip, and it shows the web of wisdom in action. It'll take a little bit of time to load, but it shows, it's shot by people who are working to protect and preserve the rainforest. So this is a practical application of creation theology. And it doesn't need any further introduction, just watch these amazing images, and the background is a hymn of praise. And we shall, at the end of this little clip, we'll take our break and then come back after a break of, say, 15 minutes, because the second session this morning is a little bit longer than the first one.